Good afternoon. Welcome to Humanities in Session, the CHR's regular humanities seminar that comes in various shapes and forms. And today I am absolutely thrilled to welcome Tareq Baconi to present his talk. So Tareq is a visiting research fellow at the CHR. It's his second stint. The first one was 2022. Right. In fact, that was when you wrote the first piece, What Does Apartheid Mean for Israel? Right. And really thrilled for us to host Tareq this year, particularly this year. So Tareq is well known, is president of the board of Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. He's currently working on a new book manuscript about decolonization, non-partition, and the question of Palestine in the 21st century. Recently, in fact, his recent book manuscript is currently under publication. And what's the title of this new second book?
There's still no title.
Oh, untitled.
Untitled.
Okay, untitled. Watch this space. Tareq is also author and is most well known, or not most, but very well known for his book Hamas Contained, The Rise and Pacification of Palestinian Resistance, which was published by Stanford University Press. His writing has also appeared in Mada Masr, in New York Review of Books, in London Review of Books, Foreign Policy, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and a host of other international titles. Tareq, I should add, also has written and published short stories, and most recently, a very beautiful film script for a short film, an experimental short film, and of course was based recently in Ramallah as a senior analyst for the International Crisis Group. So without further ado, when I invited Tareq to present today's talk, I asked him if he could start off, given the CHR's research questions, given the kinds of conversations and intellectual discussions that are unfolding in our context, if he could kind of take off from his article, his piece on what apartheid means for Israel, which was at a very, very important moment in the unfolding both of the regime's Nakba and its kind of contemporary effects of including genocide, but also to kind of update it and bring it into the contemporary by way of speaking through some of his thinking in relation to his new book manuscript on decolonization in the 21st century. So now, with no further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Tareq, and we'll have an opportunity for conversation afterwards. Thank you, Tareq.
It's very meaningful for me to be here at CHR, and I'm very grateful for being hosted again. And to be presenting on this in South Africa. I was telling Heidi before we started that, I've spoken a lot in the West on these issues and in the Arab world on these issues, and the contexts are very different. But talking about apartheid and what apartheid means for Israel in South Africa is obviously a very powerful experience. So I'll be talking not for very long, for maybe 15 minutes or so, because I'd also love to learn from everyone in the room and to hear reactions and provocations. So that's the spirit with which I'm coming here. So what I thought I would do is do three sub-points that I'll sort of structure my intervention around. So as Heidi said, the piece, What Apartheid Means for Israel, was published in 2021. So I want to talk a bit about that moment, that particular moment in 2021. And then I want to think about 2023, 2024, and the ongoing genocide. And then I'll end with sort of a nod towards where we go from here and how do we think about decolonization amidst this darkness. So 2021, and this is how I actually begin the piece, for me was a turning point in Palestine. And for those of you who don't recall some of the developments that were happening then, I'll just give the sort of broad strokes in terms of context. But it was a moment in time when the Israeli settlers were trying to dispossess Palestinians from the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem. And this was happening and unfolding during the month of Ramadan of that year. And that very small neighborhood became the microcosm of what Zionism was doing, had always done, and was doing in Palestine then. But what ended up happening and unfolding over the course of many months was that Sheikh Jarrah microcosm became the lightning rod for a mobilization, for a protest that Palestinians eventually called the Unity Intifada. It was an uprising that was completely unplanned, but that, unlike the uprisings of the past few years, was incredible in the sense that it showed the singularity of the Palestinian people. The Intifada was one that mobilized Palestinians in Jerusalem, in the immediate vicinity of Sheikh Jarrah, but also brought in Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza, Palestinian citizens of Israel, the 48ers, and the diaspora, the sort of the refugees around the land of historic Palestine. That uprising was one that had immediately grasped the consciousness of the Palestinians in a way that no uprising had done since probably the first Intifada. I mean, we can talk a bit about the first and the second Intifadas, but probably since those Intifadas, it was this uprising that overcame the fragmentation that had been imposed on the Palestinians in terms of the stratified legal and geographic categories that they had been placed under. And so in terms of the consciousness of the sort of the contemporary consciousness of Palestinians, it was a reaffirmation of the singularity of their peoplehood. Now, this was the immediate context for Palestine. Things were happening in the background. Two main things. One is that the Trump administration was moving to dismantle all the core pillars of the Palestinian struggle, declaring Jerusalem the capital of Israel, dismantling UNRWA and the right of Palestinian refugees, ingratiating Israel in the broader Arab context through the normalization agreements, and enabling and legitimizing the annexation, the creeping annexation of the West Bank. All of these things were pointing to the fact that there was a Western and even regional assessment that the Palestinian issue had been stabilized, that it was a non-issue, that there could be an entrenchment of Israel's rule over the entirety of that area with no pushback. So that's one of the things that was happening. And the other thing that was happening was that there was, as a counter to that, a growing recognition among the Israeli and the international human rights discourse that Israel was practicing the crime of apartheid. And three main reports came out in 2021. One was from B'Tselem, which was Israel's leading human rights organization, which stated that Israel is a regime of Jewish supremacy from the river to the sea. And it said that even though the organization had been tasked with looking at human rights violations inside the OPT, it had now determined that it was time to look at human rights violations from the river to the sea. Shortly afterwards, Human Rights Watch issued a report saying that a threshold had been crossed. Now Israel had become an apartheid state. And a bit after that, the Human Rights Watch report stated that and focused on apartheid in the OPT. And then shortly after that, Amnesty International issued a report saying, actually, this is a regime of apartheid from the river to the sea, and its focus is on racial segregation and domination. Now, these two things, the rise of the Palestinian Unity Intifada, the assertion of the singularity of their peoplehood, and the recognition that actually we're dealing with a singular regime of apartheid from the river to the sea, was for me and for many Palestinians, a turning point, specifically on the issue of partition. Because until that moment, and arguably even till now, the international discourse and the thinking about Israel-Palestine is one that upholds the distinction between Israel as Israel proper, this liberal democracy that exists within the armistice line, within the Green Line, and its military occupation in the OPT. The two things are held as distinct. And that thinking around partition is central to policymaking and to international engagement with Palestine. So when those two things emerged, those two sort of Palestinian uprising and international consensus emerged, we firmly moved, at least in our consciousness, away from partition and towards non-partition, towards understanding the singularity of this space and towards breaking apart this imaginary distinction between Israel and its military occupation. So that, I have to say, was a belated reckoning by these human rights organizations around the narrative of apartheid that Palestinians had been talking about for years. And unlike what the recognition towards non-partition was, for Palestinians, this was not a threshold crossed. This was not a moment where Israel turned from being one liberal democracy within the armistice line and into an apartheid state. This was always an apartheid state. Our understanding as Palestinians of Israel is that Zionism is a settler colonial ideology, a racist ideology that began at the turn of the century and that constituted itself as a regime of apartheid in 1948. And that regime of apartheid first worked and enacted its policies within Israel against the Palestinians who had remained, and then exported it into the occupied territories before. So despite there being some kind of distinction between how Palestinians understood apartheid and how the international human rights community was dealing with it, we were nonetheless in a turning point in terms of understanding the inextricable link between Israel and its presence in the occupied territories. So that's where we were in 2021. I want us to think about 2023. So we can talk in the Q&A about, or in the discussion afterwards, about Hamas and Hamas's attack on October 7th. And I think it's important to sort of open up that conversation if people here are interested. But for the purposes of my intervention, I want to focus a bit more on the idea of partition and on the idea of what apartheid means at this moment in the context of Hamas's attack and in the context of the genocide that's been ongoing since. So one of the things that I've encountered in my work among Palestinians is a deep misunderstanding often of what apartheid is. And some of the reactions that I get when I talk about apartheid, when we talk about the singularity of this regime, the fact that Palestinians in the West Bank and Palestinians in New York are facing one regime of apartheid, is that Palestinians often come to this from a point of racial segregation. So they think and they speak of ending apartheid as seeking equality within the state of Israel. So their thinking is, if we're moving away from this idea of partition and this idea of state building in the occupied territories, so the West Bank and the Gaza Strip with East Jerusalem as the capital, then really what we're saying is we want equality in the only sovereign that exists in this space, which is the state of Israel. We're going to become Israeli citizens. And this misunderstanding of apartheid is one that is reflected in the discourse of the international human rights organizations, which come to apartheid, as I had just mentioned, in terms of something that is focused on a separation between Israel and how it implements its military occupation, but also with a focus on the mechanics of racial segregation, so disparate roads for settlers versus Palestinians. One of the things that we often hear from Israelis is, well, this can't really be an apartheid state. We have Palestinians in the Knesset. So one of the things that I think about when I'm talking about apartheid and when I'm sort of thinking about Israeli apartheid is what is the nature of this apartheid? And over the course of the research, obviously through the history of South Africa and how South Africa brought apartheid into the convention, I engage with this question through a question of settler colonialism. We cannot understand apartheid in Palestine without understanding Zionism as a settler colonial movement. What that means, in essence, is that when we're talking about apartheid, we're not actually talking about the racial segregation and the systems of domination. What's actually the core of apartheid is the demographic engineering and the population transfers that enabled the creation of a Jewish state to emerge in a land that is populated by Palestinians, some of whom were Jews, but not the majority. This is the system of apartheid that we seek to understand and unravel. So if we start thinking about Palestine beyond the context of non-partition, and we're thinking about it as a singular entity, what we see is the following. We see that the Gaza Strip is a population, the majority of whom are not from the Gaza Strip, that are placed behind walls, that are placed in an enclave that is being separated. We see the occupied West Bank as also a place where many refugees and refugee communities continue to exist that are held behind a wall, the separation barrier. And we see Palestinian refugees, around 7 million of them, being unable to return. That taking up of space by the Israeli state is the prerequisite to Israel being a Jewish state. Without that architecture of demographic engineering and ethnic cleansing, Israel wouldn't exist as a Jewish state. So when we want to talk about Israeli apartheid, what we're actually saying is that for a Jewish state to exist in Palestine is apartheid. A Jewish state in Palestine is the embodiment of apartheid. And that's the core of Zionism as a racist ideology, that they could create that kind of entity. And so then the question becomes, well, what are we talking about then when we're talking about non-partition? Are we talking about the dismantlement of Israel as a Jewish state? And this is precisely where Palestinians end up being cornered in discourse, because the idea of partition is a century-old idea, and it's an idea that's codified in international law. Recognition of Israel that came shortly after independence was declared codified the idea of partition. It was based on UN Resolution 181, the partition of historic Palestine into a Palestinian and a Jewish state. Any kind of engagement with international law by Palestinians is predicated on accepting partition and is therefore predicated on legitimating Zionism. The PLO became recognized as a representative of the Palestinian people only after it recognized Israel. So what the international body of international law, the body of sort of the UN, is saying that the only way Palestinians can engage in questions of self-determination is by legitimating Zionism and by legitimating the colonization of 3/4 of their homeland. And so this presents a straitjacket. How do Palestinians engage with questions of international law and with a popular liberation struggle when that system itself is still a colonial system that has internalized and legitimated the partition of Palestine? So when we begin to think about these things, we then understand what's happening today in Gaza. The Israeli state, since its creation, since 1948, has been able to maintain this partition and this architecture of demographic engineering pretty much unchallenged. October 7th challenged that in ways that I believe are irreversible. For the first day, or for the first time, Hamas's attack was able to shatter the illusion that Palestinians can be placed outside of this architecture of demographic engineering with no cost to Israeli Jews. And it was able to shatter the idea that there can be security for Israeli Jews without dealing with the question of Palestine. So overnight, within minutes of the attack happening, we see the whole architecture of partition collapse. Now we're living in a reality which is non-partition. We see that this fabric, this architecture, is a makeup that is unreal and that's going to be dismantled. What's Israel's response to this? Israel's response to this is immediate genocide. Because if Palestinians cannot be placed behind walls and managed indefinitely, then Palestinians must be exterminated. The only way that Israel can exist as a Jewish state in Palestine is if Palestinians are ethnically cleansed or erased. They cannot be ethnically cleansed, even though they tried the first weeks after October 7th to bring them into Jordan. In the absence of that, we see a genocide happening. And so when we think about the engagement or the confrontation between Palestinians and Israeli apartheid, what we're actually seeing is a confrontation between Palestinians demanding a right to remain on their land and exercising self-determination, confronting an ideology that is annihilationist, that's saying actually the only way there can be any kind of Jewishness in this land is through apartheid and partition. In the absence of that, it's genocide and ethnic cleansing. So it's an existential battle. Now, I think that this is fundamental for our understanding about where we go from here, because there's still the discourse of partition, the two-state solution, national self-determination for both peoples in the global consciousness. But for Israelis and Palestinians, this is very clear. This is an existential battle. Either Zionism exists and enables and reiterates and retrenches as a regime of Jewish supremacy in Palestine, which means the completion of the Nakba, or it means that Palestinians are able to push forward a decolonial project that's grounded in freedom, justice, and equality. Which brings me to the final point that I want to sort of talk about, which is that when we're thinking about decolonization in the 21st century for Palestinians, a few things sort of go through my mind when I'm thinking about this. And this is where the piece sort of published in 2021, now in 2023, at the time of the genocide, our thinking has been developing. One of the most important things in terms of the scholarship around this is that the importance of Palestinians theorizing what apartheid is. And South Africa obviously presents an incredibly important and rich terrain with which we can sort of engage with these questions. But the analogies only go so far. And it's very important for Palestinians to develop a context-sensitive theorization of what their engagement with apartheid is. And so if we think about 2021 as this moment of apartheid coming into the global consciousness, and then we think about 2023 as a moment when genocide is happening, the thinking around these questions for Palestinians is, well, what is the right theoretical and legal framework for us to engage with these questions? And here I want to signal out the work of a dear friend and colleague, Rabia Ikhbariya, who's been thinking about the legal concept of the Nakba. How do we understand the particular experience of Palestinians as confronting Zionism as the bringing together of apartheid and of genocide and of settler colonialism, and particularly that being a crime that the Palestinians are encountering, and that being a crime of erasure and dispossession, a crime of bringing people off of their homeland for that homeland to be captured by another people. So if we think about this being our crime, the ongoing Nakba, and that it constitutes apartheid and it constitutes genocide, that it constitutes settler colonialism, how then do we think about decolonization? How then do we think about undoing the Nakba and dismantling this regime of supremacy that's been imposed on Palestinians? And this is the work that I'm trying to think through and trying to do today. And I'm going to just share a couple of points around that. One is when we're thinking about this ongoing Nakba as a structure of domination and violence, I think it's very important when Palestinians are theorizing the crime that's being imposed on them, for Palestinians to also theorize the antidote to that crime. And even though we've been in almost 4 decades now of, I think, a misguided strategic path, which is one focused on partition and state building. And now we're coming back into a realization that that's not the path for liberation, that it has to be a non-partitioned and decolonial path going forward. The same way we're theorizing the Nakba, we need to theorize what our revolutionary struggle looks like in the 21st century. And to do that is not to create something anew, is to go back into our archives, to go back into our thinking, and to understand how our ancestors thought about revolution. And the minute we begin to do that, we're actually breaking out of the idea of partition solely within Palestine. We're also breaking out of the idea of the nation state. We're breaking out of the idea of Palestine as distinct from the region. We're breaking out of the idea of thinking of the region as a set of authoritarian dictatorships that are actually the impact of or the result of an incomplete process of decolonization, that these regimes are not representative of their people and still tethered to empire in various ways. And so when we start theorizing in this way and aim to resuscitate and excavate our revolutionary legacy, we see that partition has many levels and many depths. And this is where I think it becomes really powerful for us to think about what does decolonization mean, what does solidarity mean, how do we begin to engage in ways that are effective. And the last point that I want to make is that when we're thinking in these terms, then we also need to be thinking about what the politics of a liberation struggle mean. I think when we look at the past year, it's been a moment of extreme darkness, and it's been very sobering. But at the same time, it's been a resuscitation of energy and understanding around Palestine in ways that would have, for me, been unimaginable more than a year ago. But that kind of mobilization often feels like it's on the level of the grassroots and is not yet political. It hasn't yet developed political power. It hasn't yet figured out how to engage with the questions I was just talking about in terms of the limitations of international law, in terms of engaging with the other state actors in the region, in terms of thinking about, Western hegemony. All of these political questions that we understand on a narrative level, but we haven't yet figured out on a political level. The reason for that is by design. The PLO has been emptied of its revolutionary potential by design, by assassination, by exile, by executions and imprisonment, and all of the ways that we know. But how do we rebuild these institutions? How do we re-inject that revolutionary power, that political awareness into our thinking of Palestine and liberation? Those are the things that are animating me. And I'll just end with one note, which is to say that this book that I'm working on, I'm still very much in the early stages of it. But when I think about decolonization, the concepts that I'm playing with are really 5 concepts. And I just want to put them out here so that we can maybe engage with them and think about them together. One is the concept of the native. How do we think about Palestinians as indigenous when we're thinking about a national liberation struggle? What's the national? And how do we think about these questions of decolonization? The second is the settler. And I'm very much thinking about Mahmoud Mamdani's work around when the settler becomes native. How do we think about indigeneity and the settler now becoming, the settler colony that is Israel being in Palestine? How do we incorporate that into our thinking of national liberation? I'm thinking about the struggle. What does the struggle mean in terms of thinking about asymmetric warfare, in terms of thinking about the balance of forces on the ground? And specifically, this is where October 7th becomes particularly powerful as a moment of the week really shattering the paradigm that we're in and shifting us into a moment of disequilibrium. I'm thinking about ethics. How do we shape a struggle that's grounded in a very particular strategic purpose that's informed by ethics? How do we talk about violence, and how do we talk about sort of the way that struggle is waged. And I'm thinking about regimes. How do we break apart regimes in a systematic way? These structures of domination that are sort of imposed on us and prevent any kind of equity or justice from being achieved. So I threw a lot out there. I'm thinking about a lot of these things, and I'd love to be in conversation with you all to unpack some of them.
I don't know where to start, but the one, of course, is just the reference, question of the reference, is that concept or the theory of the Nakba, the article that was embargoed and all the controversy in Columbia Journal. Okay, so we need to access that one. That's Rabia, what? Okay, that's great. No, we followed that controversy. And okay, so on the archive, I mean, for me, the first use, as somebody sitting in South Africa, the first use of settler colonialism was from Maxine Rodinson's long piece, which was translated later. It was a piece in the French, Le Temps Moderne or something, and then anyway. But I think there was a longer theorization in the Arabic scholarship in Palestine itself. And so I'm just wondering if you can say something more about that. From the 60s already, there's that theorization of settler colonialism. And I mean, not to take up all the space with questions, Arab nationalism, because when you referred to going to this archive, I mean, these are all fake states. I mean, we see created by the French and the British and so on. So what still remains of Arab nationalism? From the outside, I mean, they are on their knees, all these regimes. I mean, the worst is Egypt, you know, which has the biggest. Anyway, it just goes on. You know what I'm saying. What still remains in resuscitating that, because they're all on their knees as far as we can see.
My question is ultimately about time. As someone who's involved in a lot of organizing around Palestine liberation and solidarity, for those of us deeply involved, there's a sense of genocide is happening now. It's very urgent. Similarly, there's a sense of racist subjugation has been happening for 100 years. It's not new. But then the contrast between that and what you're describing, how 2021, not very long ago, there's a key turning point in a certain kind of intellectual conscientization, theorization, and just that we know that the way that international politics and human rights moves is quite slow on these things. And so my question is, you know, how do we be in the world around this? How do we navigate the tension between, it's been going on forever, we need something to happen now, but we also sort of know that it won't happen right now. How do you navigate that?
What we're experiencing in this moment and what we're seeing unfold in the Middle East is that we might not have understood apartheid in this country, and that there's something fundamentally wanting in our critique of apartheid. And so it would be very important for us to think about what the signifier apartheid is doing. Not only in the present, not only in relation to its geographies, but I think there's something else going on. And, you know, I've been arguing that apartheid in many ways, and Verwoerd in particular, was a deceptive thinker. And so apartheid is a very deceptive term, and hidden in there is a deceptive plot. And so there's something that is worth, you know, digging into. I suppose the question I have, and, you know, it's my thinking also in relation to what Mamdani had given us in Citizen and Subject, and what is lacking in that reading, is the questions that were raised through the movements of black consciousness in the 70s here, but also earlier through the labor movements in the 1970s, is the question of the psychic effects and modalities of control, and the other is the way in which technological forms of labor organization and then the control of desire unfolded in the post-48 world. And the coincidence here I want to draw attention to, I'm not sure how to square this, is that in the same year that this political rationality takes hold, the discourse of cybernetics, the science of cybernetics, takes hold in the world. And I'm wondering whether the force of this technological warfare that we're seeing unfold is also exceeding the kind of national frame, but is producing forms of sensory despair that is going to become a planetary condition beyond the Middle East. So, we might see this as apartheid's manifestation of permanent war. And apartheid was a form of permanent war, of endless war. So I wondered if you had any thoughts on how we might think the question of the psychic and technological now as part and parcel of what might be missing in our critique of apartheid.
The Palestinian theorization of settler colonialism and pan-Arabism. In the piece, I draw quite heavily on the work of Fayez al-Sayegh, who wrote one of the key monographs of to come out of Palestinian intellectuals in the 60s. He wrote it in 1965, before the occupation began, in which he theorized Zionism as racism and how Zionism is settler colonialism. And that was a key text. I mean, that thinking had already begun to permeate. Obviously, other scholars like Walid al-Khalidi and others had begun thinking about some of these things. But that monograph by Fayez al-Sayegh was very powerful. And even around the same time by Sabri Jirias, who was a Palestinian citizen of Israel, who diagnosed the way Israel implemented apartheid on its Palestinian citizens who had remained after 48. So that thinking was already permeating in the way Palestinians were theorizing settler colonialism. But particularly Sayegh's monograph is important is because he starts talking about the South African experience. So he starts talking about the Afrikaner nationalism and making links between Palestinians and Black South Africans. So this is before the occupation had even begun. So settler colonialism, so for Palestinians, the way apartheid is understood has always been through settler colonialism. We always understand Zionism through colonialism. The way that apartheid was, and when the Palestinians came to the Durban conference here in 2001, this is how they also presented apartheid as settler colonialism. The critique of the reports that then 20 years later in 2021 produced this discourse of apartheid on the international stage is that they shed it of its colonialism. So if you look at the Human Rights Watch reports or the Amnesty International reports, they don't talk about colonialism. It doesn't exist. They talk about apartheid as racial segregation. They're looking at apartheid on the surface level. They're not understanding its colonial DNA. And that was the critique of Palestinians of these reports, that, okay, now you're coming to the Palestinian narrative of understanding Zionism and settler colonialism, but you're actually choosing it in a way that enables us to think about it in very shallow ways, so that actually the antidote to apartheid is equality in a state that isn't decolonized. That's not what Palestinians are fighting for. And so this is why the theorization is actually very important, and going back to how Palestinians are holding the line about what we understand our struggle to be, how we understand Zionism as settler colonialism becomes fundamental, and how we sort of, it's I think, and as in any liberation struggle, we have to live in the paradoxes. We have to be able to both say that there is power in international organizations coming out and saying this is apartheid, while pushing that exact discourse to say this is insufficient, and this is what we understand Palestinian liberation to be fighting. Now, the issue of Arab nationalism is one that I feel honestly most confused about, and it's something that I've been thinking a lot about, because I do not think there can be liberation for Palestine without the dismantlement of authoritarianism in the region. The revolutions that began in 2010, for me, there's no way that the Tahrir revolutions, the Syrian revolutions, there's no way these revolutions will pass without Jerusalem being free. They're inextricably linked. At the same time, pan-Arabism has been co-opted into either Islamist or secular forms of authoritarianism that are very powerful and that reify the partitions of our region. And if we're thinking about what's happening at this moment today, the genocide, the Israeli attacks against Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, and the inability of Jordan and Egypt to do anything about that, and the support, the implicit support of Saudi, Bahrain, and the UAE to what's happening. What we're seeing is an Israeli effort to redraw the map of the region all the way up to removing the head of the octopus, Iran. That's how Israeli leaders talk about it. So decapitating Iran and creating a region where Israel is at the heart as the regional power, and there's a military architecture around that maintains authoritarian regimes in place through military dictatorship and securitization, and all other states are failed states. So Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon become failed states. Now that's the vision. That's the vision for the region. Thinking as an antidote to that, for me, is resuscitating Pan-Arabism from its 60s and 70s into a new discourse, into a new way of thinking about what does the region look like if it's democratized. And I'm not thinking about democracy in the American imperial sort of form of democratization, but if there are actually forms of power that are representative of the people in the street, how do we think about Palestine as the core to that? I don't know that we've done enough work on Pan-Arabism in that sense. I don't know that we've theorized Pan-Arabism enough, but I think that the Pan-Arabism of the 60s and 70s is dead in the water. We need to sort of rethink it in light of, because there is a regional imposition that's bringing the region back in under Israeli domination. So there's almost a Trojan horse here that we are all brought in one envelope. How do we break it apart? Time and urgency. You know, I think every Palestinian has been grappling with this for the past year, because there is the sense of urgency is indescribable. You know, every day where this genocide isn't ending is a day where, you know, this week was horrifying. It's horrifying. And thinking about what's happening every single day while trying to theorize and think in a longer term is sometimes impossible. And so your question lands with me as a very practical question, as how are we able to hold the immediacy of the moment and to say, actually, nothing else matters but stopping the killing, just stopping the killing. And then we'll talk about everything else, while also understanding that this is the work that we need to theorize, we need to think in the longer term, we need to sort of break out of the urgency of this moment. And I think that's why for many, it's actually paralysis. It's sort of an inability to figure out how to exist in those two temporal dimensions. But I think that there's no way out, because it's the urgency of the moment. I mean, now it's extreme because of the genocide, but there's always been this momentum, this tidal wave at getting us focused on the act of living, on being able to stay on the ground, without breaking out of that. We need to break out of the settler time. We need to be able to both live in the urgency of defiance and sumud today, and in theorizing and thinking about where we want to go from here and having that strategic vision, because that's the only way we break out of it. And one of the things that I've been thinking about when it comes to time is how it's funny, but so I'm talking about how we go back into our legacy and we sort of bring back our revolutionary legacy, right? Like in some ways going back into the 60s and 70s, but even before that, into the pre-Nakba, reclaiming Palestine before the Nakba. And I'm also thinking about living in the imaginary, the future imaginary, thinking about Palestine post-Nakba. How do you hold both that past and that future today? How are you able to bend time in that way, to exist in the moment of struggle today, drawing on that history and imagining that future? And I think that temporality somehow is what has to inform our struggle. We're in the middle of the Nakba now, but we have to be able to both reach back and have this radical imagining into the future and hold both of these things together. This is how I try to think about it. I think it's very, very difficult. I think it's also in many ways individual. What is the capacity of the individual at a moment in time? And I think these are the questions of activists and the movement today. But I think this is both a practical issue and a theoretical issue. And it's very hard. I don't know if I have the right answer to that. I guess I want to say a couple of things. One is, when we're thinking about the psychic effects, partition is also internal. And I think that's how I think about Palestinian agency, and how I think about being able to reclaim a sense of power. And I think that departitioning happens within as a prerequisite to anything else. So in that way, I think it's very powerful, because it gives a certain level of control. You know, we're not talking about partition in these massive ways. We're talking about partition within. At the same time, technology is very effective at partitioning internally. It's very effective at creating dullness and apathy and inactivity and despair. And I think this has been weaponized in ways that I don't understand, certainly. I'm sure people are theorizing around this, but I think it's become internalized within our psyche in ways that are very scary. And just think about this moment, you know, the genocide is happening, it's being live streamed, we're all watching it, and either we're feeling this sense of urgency, but we're in, you know, surroundings that are not in that space, and we all feel adrenaline and fear and grief, and we don't know what to do with it. Or we're horrified into silence and into paralysis, and we don't do anything about it. One of the things that was most enraging, but also sad, you know, deep grief for me, was that there was no mobilization anywhere outside of Gaza in Palestine. 48ers were terrified, West Bankers were terrified, Jordan and Egypt were paralyzed. It felt like we were watching it and everyone was silent. We couldn't do anything. And this sense of helplessness and despair. So I think there's a technological dimension to this. This wouldn't have happened, or this is the first genocide to unfold in this way. How it's changed our psyche, our relationship to action, our relationship to internally departitioning is I don't know what the answer to that question is, but I think it's something that's very powerful. So that's one thing. The second thing on technology, you know, I'm thinking about decolonization in the 21st century, but what I'm also thinking about is that Zionism is modeling to us what colonialism in the 21st century looks like, and it's very technological. The artificial intelligence, Lavender, the pager attacks in Lebanon, they're breaking down the separation between civilian and non-civilian in ways that are horrifying. We've seen them do that on issues of extrajudicial executions that become targeted assassinations, that become the Obama administration using drone attacks in Afghanistan ad nauseum. What's happening now is on another level, and it's driven by AI. So what we're thinking about today in terms of colonialism of the 21st century is technology, and is an ability to not only infiltrate the way they infiltrated Hezbollah and Hamas, but also to weaponize space, to weaponize public spaces, so that, you know, a grocery store becomes an attack of, becomes a ground zero of a war. How does this change the way we then engage in struggle? I think this is something to theorize, but I also think, back to the point of the urgency of the moment, Hamas and Hezbollah failed to understand this in the past year, and have therefore been exposed to the kind of extrajudicial executions happening at the top in ways that are insane. The fact that these movements were still operating without yet understanding that this is the AI that's animating how Israel is picking out these people, meant that they were vulnerable to, you know, being decapitated, which is what happened. So I think the level of how Israel is rapidly developing the technology of colonialism, it's much quicker than how we've learned to respond to it. But I think it's a prerequisite, actually, to figuring out how to engage with it.
Incredibly thoughtful and thorough and granular, and I really appreciate how you kind of accumulating a set of arguments that are building on what you presented at the beginning. I do have a number of questions, but let me start with one, and it will surely be the most unpopular in the room because it places the figure of the Jew in the discussion, and so much of what you've spoken about is about decentering, that kind of looming presence that comes with not only a political history and a territorialized and territorial one, but one of violence and also of existential menace and danger. But Edward Said and the dearly recently departed Elias Khoury have both spoken. So Elias Khoury, in his very important piece on rethinking the Nakba, which he does through the literary, he makes the comment about Palestinians becoming the Jews' Jew, the Jews of the Jews. Edward Said, and I think it's in the question of Palestine, or the idea of Palestine, the question of Palestine. He observes that the kind of burden, and perhaps this is part of a certain kind of singularity, or in elaborating singularity, that the burden of Palestinians is to be faced with an oppressor who are Jewish, the figure of the Jew as the oppressor. And given the coevalness in terms of time, both of Europe's genocide, let's say Europe's genocides, and the formation of a state whose alibi was sanctuary, it seems to me there's a foundational paradox. And if liberation is to and can only be led by a Palestinian movement, whatever Palestinian, and that's another question, who and what are the Palestinian people? And that's a hugely complicated and so kind of inscribed in this these epochs and waves of fragmentation that has been a tactic of and a strategy of the state, driven by a kind of seemingly marginal right-wing extremist, but that's the kind of driving force of the project. How to theorize this particular kind of burden and the paradox of the inheritance of for the West, a certain kind of Ur-victim, but also for Palestinians to carry the burden of theorizing their oppressor. How are you thinking about that? Can you talk that through? And, apologies if that's offensive. I just think it's so much at the heart of the questions you were laying out for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. I don't think it's offensive at all. I think it's crucial, actually. I'll share some thoughts on this. I've long thought that there's no way Palestinians can achieve their vision of a decolonized Palestine without engaging with what it means that they were and are colonized in the name of Jewishness. Because that's how Zionism is co-opting and capturing Judaism. And so I think disentangling that is extremely important for Palestinians. One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is that part of the reason we see this kind of Western knee-jerk support for Zionism and for what Israel is doing today. There's obviously a geostrategic element, but I'm not going to talk about that. I think there's actually a deeper psychological element, which is that the West is unable to confront European anti-Semitism and whiteness, sort of its own white supremacy. And for them to really be able to deal with the question of Palestine, it actually means putting a mirror onto their own history and the genocides that they're sort of thinking about, which is a frightening prospect for Palestinians, because what that means is we're not fighting Zionism, we're fighting Western supremacy. And this is a huge burden to place on anyone, but certainly on Palestinians. But I think that that's why Palestine becomes, for me, in some ways, the linchpin of these questions on the global level. When we think about the moment in time we're living in where Western hegemony is being challenged. And that's happening in different ways. You know, we see the international order being used in a certain way after Russia invades Ukraine. And then when it happens in Israel, obviously there's a completely different reaction. There are countries that are pushing back against that, South Africa being one, Namibia, Colombia, Brazil, China. So there's a geopolitical shift that's happening that's challenging Western supremacy. And I think Palestine, it runs through Palestine. Gaza becomes sort of the linchpin because of this issue of the West needing to confront its own history of anti-Semitism, its own genocidal history, and its own sort of commitment to supremacy. And so Palestine becomes the way that the question of European anti-Semitism becomes confronted. So I think it's important for us to theorize that just as a way of us to understand what is this adversary we're facing? So that's one thing. The second thing is that from a very strategic perspective, forgetting morality, forgetting ethics, from a strategic perspective, our Jewish comrades and allies are a key part of this struggle. Their struggle is slightly different, which is that Zionism is also one that has endangered their Jewishness and their rights. It's made their Jewishness co-opted into an ethno-nationalist state. And it's arguably increased their vulnerability and their exposure. So they have a mission and a challenge of reclaiming Jewishness and disentangling Jewishness from Zionism, creating spaces of Jewish life and ritual and institutions that are not co-opted into genocide. That's a mission and a challenge that also speaks to a Palestinian seeking to dismantle Zionism. So solely from a strategic perspective, there's an allyship and a camaraderie there that's important to sort of diffuse this accusation and weaponization of anti-Semitism. But I also think that it goes beyond strategy, that it's also an ethical and a moral issue. Zionism, there's obviously no comparison between the violence and the cost and the destruction it's wrought on Palestinians compared to others, but it's a shared enemy that we both need to dismantle if we want to think of a world that is egalitarian and safe. And so for Palestinians to hold that, I think it's a huge burden, but I also think of it as a privilege. I think of it as a calling for us to be able to theorize and lead out of this this sort of this co-optation of Jewishness and in the service of Western hegemony. So I think I don't. And so the last thing I want to say on this is actually back to the point, Pramesh, you pointed out, and thinking about Mamdani and your point, and think, who are the Palestinians? Mamdani's work on neither settler nor native tries to break out of that binary and tries to say that actually let's not think about settlers now and natives, and let's think about a different way of creating a unit that's able to bring the two together. And obviously there's a settler colony, there are Israelis. We need to figure out how the national can be expanded to encompass both Palestinians and Israelis. And I think there's something interesting in his way of thinking about that from South Africa, from US and indigenous peoples there. But I think there's something that's missing in that thinking and in that research, which is the act of justice and the act of reparation that is needed for the settler to become native. How does the Jewish presence on that land come into the nation through equity and through making up for the violence of the past century? We cannot go into an embrace of Jewish presence in Palestine without first talking about what decolonization is and how we achieve justice. Now, we have to push on that while we're also saying that Jewishness is indigenous to Palestine. The co-optation of Jewishness and its indigeneity to Palestine into a settler colonial project, that's what Zionism did. We don't have a problem saying that Jewishness is intrinsic and is a part of Palestinian life. The way that it's been made sectarian and weaponized in that way, that's settler colonialism. That's not our issue. So we need to be able to hold both of these things, to reclaim Jewish presence in Palestine while also calling for justice and reparation and restitution, and sort of coming through the work of liberation to that, not imposing new containers that might break us out of those binaries.
What is the space for the non-Muslim, the non-Jew? 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago when we marched in Durban, this was a human rights issue. Before human rights got, a really dismantled through critiques of, actually from the left, but much more recently and much more devastatingly, I think, from the kind of new forms of right politics and mobilization. So it's a question which, if you've got time after the next round, it would be interesting to hear you reflect on that.
For very loud reasons, recognize October 7th as the start of all of this, but I want to draw attention back to June, July 2023 in Jenin. And can you talk a little bit about how you read Jenin into October 7th and how how Jenin is an equally important moment in where we are today? The second question I have is with respect to the language of genocide and the use of why we frame it as a genocide now. And I want to draw our attention back to the beginning of the 21st century, I think it's 2001, 2003, where Ilan Pape writes about or calls calls what is happening in Palestine as an incremental genocide. And for those who remember, what he meant by that is it's either we kill you in your homes or we push you out. And why that incremental genocide, why is the incremental part that have been removed from the language of genocide today? And not this moment being recognized as an imminent genocide. And I think that the framing and the language of this is very important, because the world has only decided to wake up now in which to frame this as a genocide, whereas it has been going on for the past X amount of years. The last part is to just follow off the Mamdani point of neither settler nor native. Now, a few years ago, we hosted Mamdani as part of a webinar series in which we launched his book, Neither Settler Nor Native. And reading his work, especially the work on Israel-Palestine, led me to believe that Mamdani's argument is in no way radical. In fact, it is the dream of liberalism that he's trying to realize. That pushing, it is to speak of a kind of a non-racialism in which we say, I don't see color, I don't see ethnicity, I don't see race, I don't see et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I want to challenge you to just think a bit more about neither settler nor native, and whether Mamdani is your ally or sympathizing with settler colonialism and Zionism within this cause. Because if we have to follow Mamdani's argument, we arrive back at the beginning of the problem that is Zionism. Thank you.
I wanted to ask the question of the for Israel in the titles. So we've been thinking in the CHR for a while about, well, what apartheid is. Do we understand what this is? And why we can use the term apartheid as a marker for what's taking place in Palestine. So just a couple of examples. A colleague of ours who was studying in the US could use the term apartheid to describe his reading of partition in Israel as a geographer, but not make reference to the reservation system in the US. Because within US Academy, you can say apartheid with very little repercussion. You make it a question of America and you don't get a job, right? So there's that side of it. But then the other side of the question is, and this comes from what you were saying right at the beginning, is around what work does the term apartheid do in a way? It makes apartheid stands as an anomaly, right? So you have your Western nation state system, and there's an anomaly of it called apartheid. In Israel now, there are bad actors that make this look, so that's the state discourse, right? You can see the quotation. So we were reading Gary Wilder this morning on Freedom Time, and the argument that perhaps we need to think outside of the method of nationalism as a way to decolonize. And I wonder if apartheid works within the method of nationalism and locks us into that discourse where we can't get out of ethnic identities, national identities, and what other mechanism we might need to... I'm not sure if settler colonialism does that, and I guess that's what's worrying in the back of my mind, and hence the question about the for Israel.
Yes, I think obviously the temporality is important. I mean, the way that Palestinians refer to this is that the ongoing Nakba never stopped. It's a continuum with moments of spectacular violence that sort of break that continuum, but the daily grind of the ongoing Nakba is lethal and persistent. So obviously it didn't start on October 7th, but something shattered on October 7th that has propelled us into a new paradigm. Now, in the immediate beginning, or in the immediate sort of months before October 7th, so 2023 was already the deadliest year for Palestinians in the West Bank in decades, and the deadliest for Palestinian children. What had been happening in Jenin and in Tulkarem was that there were, and not just in 2023, but also in 2022, formations called Arin al-Usud, so the Lion's Den, which were loosely associated with Islamic Jihad and Hamas, but not directly under their leadership. And they were essentially armed groups that were fighting back against settlers. And Israel was using tactics there that it had perfected during the Second Intifada, and then that would come to horrifying realities in Gaza, but it was already using them in refugee camps in Jenin and in Tulkarem. That was happening alongside the settler violence sort of taking the form that it did in places like Huwara. So the kind of pogroms that were happening that were state-sanctioned and that were driven by Israel. So all of these tactics and all of these ways of accelerating and decelerating the Nakba and breaking apart distinctions between civilian and combatant, and breaking apart distinctions between the state and the settler and the army, all of these things were already happening. They had been accelerating for years, but with sort of a very clear sort of right-wing trajectory in the state. So for me, when I think about the genocide, I completely agree with you. I don't think the genocide is breaking with Israeli tactics towards Palestinians. I think the genocide is a concentration of that and the realization of what Zionism has always been about, which is the erasure of Palestine and Palestinianness. And so the term genocide, I think, is intrinsic for me in the Nakba. It's a key parcel of that. Now, why are we using that term now and we don't, let's say, talk about imminent genocide? I know that there was quite a significant debate in October, November, December of last year about what does it mean legally to start talking about genocide, and what are the legal implications given that it's the crime of all crimes and it opens the door at the ICC and the ICJ. So there was a tactical or a strategic decision to be made around whether to start talking about genocide or not. And there was a fear. I have to say, I was in many conversations in the early sort of days after October 7th, when it was clear to everyone that this is going to be an event of mass killing, that if we start talking about genocide, we undermine language around apartheid, or we undermine language around the Nakba. So there were almost tactical considerations that I know that different parts of the movement grappled with these questions. But that never meant that we thought that what was happening now was something that hadn't happened before or wasn't the logical conclusion of Zionism. I think we all understood genocide and continue to understand genocide as being part and parcel of the Nakba. And I think it's important to stress that and to break out of the temporality of October 7th. But in terms of Mamdani, I think Mamdani's book is very problematic. I mean, I engage with that. I engage with his book as something to push against, rather than as something to sort of embrace or accept, because I think it's very naive. And if you want good sort of rebuttals of Mamdani's work, I would urge you to read Nadia Abul Hajj and her work on how Mamdani misreads Palestine. I mean, I think the idea that you can just simply create rhetorically a new category of being that would erase the inequality between native and settler without going through a process of decolonization is, as you say, liberal. I mean, and just completely ineffective. I mean, that will never happen. So I think we need to figure out how to engage with the concept of the native and the settler in a different way. How do we sort of bring that back into the struggle and into thinking about what decolonization means? And I think Mamdani, for me, shows me how not to do it. Right? So how to sort of think against that. Sorry if that's offensive to people. Okay, yeah. So what apartheid means for Israel, Moritz, so I have to say, this title pisses me off, and I didn't choose it. I mean, so when one publishes, one has no authority on the title. So this was the title that was chosen by the magazine, and I think part of the issue for me is exactly that, the For Israel bit, because it centers Israel. And I don't frankly care what apartheid means for Israel. I mean, the whole point is that actually apartheid is being inflicted on Palestinians and what it means for us. But so be it. I think that the question that you raise about apartheid putting us in the frame of nationalism is exactly right. And I think that's part of when I think about departitioning outside of the nation state is where I hit the limit with understanding apartheid. And I think the work, Rabia's work, is fundamental here, because if we engage with these concepts instrumentally, with apartheid, with settler colonialism, with genocide, but we accept that they do not diagnose the wholeness of our predicament, but parts of it. How then do we assemble something that's actually encompassing of everything? And I don't know if we have the answer to that question yet. Because if we start thinking about the Nakba, I do think it captures something about the experience of Palestine that places us outside of the nation state, because it immediately brings in the refugees, and it brings in the Palestinian experience in Syria, in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Egypt, further afield. So it breaks us out of the nation state immediately by the act of dispersal and by the act of scattering, and how these Palestinian communities have impacted actually the post-colony in those authoritarian states they ended up in. So there's something around the theorizing of the Nakba that breaks us out of the nation state. But at the same time, apartheid brings us back to the singularity of the regime that has taken the form of a nation state in what is now Israel, which is really important for us to also theorize and think about how to decompose. So it's almost like we have to exist in the national and the post-national. We have to be able to do both. And when we're thinking about the for Israel, I'm thinking about it as this is the way that the apartheid has conceptualized the nation state. This is the regime that we're breaking up. But then beyond Israel and in the Palestinian condition, that's a global condition. And that's where the Nakba then becomes sort of a global question. Yeah, so that's how I would grapple with that. And then, Heidi, your point about the space for the non-Muslim and the non-Jew, this is very dangerous terrain. I see it very. Before coming to the fellowship here, I spent the past year in New York. And in the US, the question of Palestine is being turned into a question of Islamophobia. That we deal with Palestine through the question of Islam. And I think this is a very dangerous and very smart tactic by American officials, because they deterritorialize and denationalize what Palestine is. And also, it results in a kind of sectarianism that isn't Palestinian. So they're imposing differences between a Muslim or a Christian or a Jewish Palestinian. And I think this is exactly the discourse that we as Palestinians need to be fighting against. And back to your point about the Jewish question, this is not our shit. This is being imposed on us. And we need to be able to reverse that and to break out of the colonial effort to sort of create sectarianism, because this is how I have to say. I'll say two quick points on this. One is we're seeing this in full clarity in what's happening today in Lebanon. There are efforts to sectarianize. There are efforts to say, we're here to deal with the Shia community, and with Hezbollah, we'll leave Christians, we'll leave Sunnis. This is creating hate and anger in a country that's been in civil war around sectarianism. So they manipulate this to very, very good effect, and I think we need to be very dangerous, very, very sort of clear about the danger of it. But the second point I want to say is that also there are Muslim communities that intentionally or otherwise reify that and sort of embrace Palestine through a religious lens. And that's also very dangerous. So that's not to say that there isn't a religious dimension, of course. I think Palestine is the home of all the monotheistic religions, and I think that's something that is important for us to reclaim. But this is not a religious conflict. This is a conflict that's territorial and settler colonial. And so I think we need to be very careful when we're talking about how this essentialism is being used when thinking about and understanding Palestine.
I think it was an absolutely superb 2 hours, and thank you for your generosity, your energy, your commitment to bring us along with your thinking. We're really looking forward to reading your book, the one that's coming out now in December. Inshallah. Please join me to thank Tareq again.